lights are down, that means it's time to get started. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit later, but for those of you who remember me, my name is Anthony Keaton. I'm your MC for tonight. And I would like to say, even though the lights are down, that in the words of Billy Crystal from Saturday Night Live, you look marvelous. And we are so happy that you're here tonight. We will start off our program with a video that's been done by Tom Wolfe. It will show some clips of past programs, and then after we watch that, we will go into the rest of the program. Thank you.
Born in 1942, I grew up in the segregated town of Ashland, where everyone had a place, and social harmony required keeping your place. I had my first lesson about that on the way to kindergarten at the Episcopal Church, then on the corner of Arlington and Center. We lived 2 blocks east. Now, even though black folks generally had their place in Berkeley Town, there were also black families at 104 and 106 Arlington Street. So as I passed by one day, I spotted a little girl about my age in the front yard of one of those houses. She smiled and waved. I smiled and waved back. I didn't see skin color. I saw a playmate. When I excitedly told my mother about the new friend, she explained why this could not be. I don't recall the exact words she used. I just remember my disappointment and sadness. I never saw her in that yard again, nor did I ever have a playmate who did not look like me.
We rode a bus 53. That was Mr. John Bird's bus. A bus number 41, Miss Louise Randolph's bus. And we would come through an area called Black Creek in Mechanicsville, Virginia. And that's where the European boys would get behind the bus, and they would pass us with the rebel flags and all this crazy paraphernalia, and they had this swing chain. They would swing that thing around and swing it at the bus or swing it up at the windows. It was a scary experience because, like the young man just said, the bus would break down so frequently. And oftentimes when the bus broke down, we had to wait there until our parent finally got there to pick us up.
I started school in 1971, attending Hanover Academy. Unknown to me at the time, Hanover Academy was established in 1959 for white families to avoid the segregation of Hanover County schools. I didn't know why I went there. I just thought it was because my older sisters did and my cousins did. I never felt like we went there due to race because we were raised by example to follow the golden rule and to focus on a person's character versus where they came from or the color of their skin. I learned later that we were removed from Hanover Academy by our parents, and our father resigned from the board after a black family was denied acceptance because of their race. The decision was later reversed, but the family chose not to attend because, of course, they didn't feel welcome.
The anticipation of getting on a school bus filled with Caucasian students was a bit scary, but I did not feel intimidated. As I got onto the bus, there wasn't a single student on the bus that looked like me. It wasn't a warm welcome, and I asked a young boy, could I sit down beside him? As soon as I asked him that, he got up and he moved. And everyone on the bus began to laugh. It was filled with laughter on the bus. Everyone laughed except me. The next day I got on the bus and asked a girl, could I sit down beside her? And she did. She allowed me to sit beside her, and the first thing I thought was she would get up and move again. Instead, she stayed and began to have a small conversation with me. From that moment on, I felt more accepted.
A memory of Mr. Strauss, better known as Snookums, stands out. I am embarrassed that I did not know his given name, but was pleased to learn later that the word Snookums was a term of endearment and not necessarily a put-down. He was a small, friendly man with some intellectual limitations who covered the town on foot and seemed to know and be known by all, as he was the shoeshine boy at LaFoon's barbershop. My elementary Sunday school class was meeting on the steps of Blackwell Auditorium when I noticed him walking north on Henry Street. My young mind assumed that meant he did not have a church to attend. So I went home and told my parents that I thought we should invite Snookums to our church. My father was not amused.
Well, I was stationed in China in 1972. My mother got killed by a white drunk driver. He never served a day. That's how it was back then. He could never understand the pain that he caused their family and the entire family. It was terrible. When I got out of the Air Force, I lived in Wilmington, North Carolina. I needed a job, so I auditioned as a news reporter at Channel 6. I got the job. I had the pleasure of meeting Coretta King, Maynard Jackson, Angela Davis, and James Brown. They came to Wilmington to support a function for the Wilmington 10, 9 black men and 1 black woman who were wrongfully convicted of arson and conspiracy in Wilmington in 1971. I moved on, and God has surely given me favor continuously. I married my childhood sweetheart. We started first grade together. We have 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and a great-grandson. We moved back to Ashland in 2004, and I retired from Philip Morris. I'm now a member of Ebenezer Baptist Church with Dr. John Kenny. It's a wonderful place to worship. And a little bit of tidbit, when God's with you, you can't lose. I didn't. Thank you.
Welcome to Untold Stories, growing up in Ashland and Hanover County, black and white experiences. Today, our panelists will be telling us about their experiences during the Civil Rights era. All of them graduated from Hanover County Public Schools between 1968 and 1972. My name is Anthony Key, and I'll be your MC for the afternoon. And if you haven't already done so, I ask that you silence your phones. Your cell phone, somebody's gonna call you, somebody's gonna send you this text telling you how much they love you and how much they want you, but we don't need to hear that today. So please silence your phone, and you can get to them later. We appreciate that. I'd like to begin by acknowledging our sponsors, the Hanover Arts and Activity Center, the Hanover County Black Heritage Society, the Ashland Museum, and the Downtown Ashland Association. I'd like to also thank Principal Chris Martinez and Matthew Crowder for allowing us to have this program in this beautiful auditorium, and to Lieutenant Jim Head, Senior Naval Science Instructor and his Navy Junior ROTC students. I also at this time would like to thank our former storytellers. We have some former storytellers who are in the audience. And I don't know if they can be seen, if you can be seen, but if you are a former storyteller and you'd like to stand, please stand so people can acknowledge you. Some other individuals I'd like to acknowledge. I'd like to acknowledge Michael Gill, our school superintendent. I'd like to acknowledge Ola Hawkins from our school board, and I'd like to acknowledge Bob Hunley also from the school board. I'd like to acknowledge give them hands. From the Ashland Town Council, I'd like to acknowledge Mayor Steve Trivett. I'd like to acknowledge John Hodges, and I'd like to acknowledge Dan McGraw, again from the Ashland. I'd like to acknowledge Frank Hartgrove. He's the clerk of the court from Hanover County. And a special person I'd like to acknowledge, I heard she's here, she's a little bit late. Not late, but we didn't know that she was here. Because she's never late, she's always on time. Always on time, remember that. And I'm talking about my good friend, Faye Pritchard, from the member of the Board of Supervisors. So I had to get that in because I don't want Faye being mad at me. Moving on, as we thank all of you for coming, and I'm talking about you as the audience, we want to thank all of you for coming. I just wanted to acknowledge that we had some concerns that we may not get a lot of people showing up because we're just coming out of the pandemic and we didn't know how comfortable people would be coming to this place. But just looking out here, you know, you really value us, you really love us, and we thank you for being here. So we want to thank you. Thank you for coming. Give yourself a round of applause for being here. And you have come here because you care about the local history from a personal perspective. The stories you'll hear will better help us to understand not just what might have been in the newspaper and in the textbook, but how those times impacted individual citizens. Each story, like each person, is different, and each tells us something different about how we all fit into our community. Following our panelists, we'll hear from Dr. Jamelle Wilson, former superintendent of Hanover County Public Schools and current dean of the University of Richmond School of Professional and Continuing Studies. She'll help us to put all of these stories into context and fit them into our broader history. Last but not least, we'll hear from the Community Gospel Choir, led by Tyler Spurlock. And we will get our hands clapping, and he will get our foot stomping with rousing music to end our program. At this time, I'd like to ask Patrick Henry High School Navy Junior ROTC students to present our flags. Please stand if you are able and join me in saying Pledge of Allegiance.
Forward. March. Colors. Halt. Left. Face. Carry. Colors. Ready. Cut. Present. Colors.
Please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Order. Colors. Ready. Cut. Right. Face. Forward. March.
Thank you to our students. They make us so proud. And now to the main portion of our program. Each of our panelists will share with us about their personal experiences growing up during the civil rights era. It was a time of change, and we all know that change can be difficult. As Bob Dylan sang, these times, they are changing. It was true then, and it's still true now. Our first storyteller is Matt Lewis. Matt was the youngest son in a family of 6 daughters and 6 sons. He graduated from Patrick Henry High School in 1972 and worked in leadership positions with Reynolds Metals, Virginia Power, and DuPont. He retired in 2019, as you'll hear from in his story. He and his classmates and his high school all had a role in the telling of the civil rights era. Welcome, Matt.
"51 years ago, I wanted to say I was in the same auditorium, but I wasn't because this is the new auditorium. The old one used to be over there. But anyway, we sung for Black History Week. It was Patrick Henry's first Black History celebration. We sung Lift Every Voice and Sing for Black History Week. During the singing of the song, some white students got up and walked out. The principal said at the time that we could not sing the Black National Anthem. We kept trying to persuade him to let us sing. But every time we would ask, he would say no, because it would offend the white students. We told him that if you listen to the words, you would see that it's a song of inspiration and hope for Black people. It inspires us to keep moving forward and looking toward the future. We were seniors at that time, and it was our last chance to sing. So we decided we were going to sing Come Hell or High Water. And we did. Now, the civil rights movement began probably because of the same two letters that principal said, no. This country was built on the word no. You can't do this, no, we can't do that. Now, I can understand it if you're dealing with a child. They don't know any better, so you have to tell them no. But what if someone would have said, maybe? What that would have done, it would have opened the door of possibilities. What if someone had said, we'll take a look at it? That would at least crack the door open for a discussion. It was tough for Black people during the civil rights era. When you watched all the horror stories on TV and you ask yourself why. When you watch blacks being beaten and manhandled, beaten with billy clubs, you watch as the fire hoses and the dogs were put on. Then you say to yourself, man, that would never happen here in Virginia, until one day it did. Minus the dogs and the water cannons. On Tuesday, February 22nd, 1972, right at this very same school, Patrick Henry High School, 37 Black students were manhandled, arms twisted behind their backs, talked smart to, and aggressively put on a bus to be taken to the Hanover County Jail. All of this was for a non-violent, peaceful, sit-down protest. We were taught that violence was not the way to get your message across. When the principal called the police, he turned a peaceful protest into a melee. The police officers started grabbing the Black students and loaded them onto the bus. Their aggressive tactics turned what was a peaceful protest into a full-scale assault. Some students had their clothes ripped and torn. One particular female student was carried onto the bus, one police officer holding her by her arms and another holding her by her legs. Now, we watched in horror at the treatment of those Black students on that day. Police grabbed them up out of their chairs and herded them off to a waiting bus to be taken off to jail. Now, all of this started with the Black History program that we did on February 18th, the Friday before. When we got back to school on Monday, we found out that 11 Black students had been suspended and were held accountable for us singing the Black National Anthem. Well, we met that day, we put our heads together, and we decided that we were going to have a peaceful protest on Tuesday and to try to get those students back to school. On Tuesday morning, we staged the protest, we walked out of class, and we met out on the schoolyard next to the old gym over there. We followed the teachings of our leader, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his foot soldiers by having a peaceful and nonviolent protest. We talked about our mission and how we were going to accomplish it. When the principal came out of his office, he told us we had to go back to class. Our reply to him was, when you bring those suspended students back, we'll go back to class. We were at a stalemate, and nobody wanted to give in. Well, we had been out there for about 3 hours. And in the meantime, the president of the SCA was in the principal's office telling him not to do anything because at 3 p.m. we would all get on the bus and go home, and the protest would be over. He tried to warn him that if the administration got the police involved, it probably was going to turn into something ugly, and it did. We looked out on Route 54, and we saw about 4 or 5 Hanover police cars pulling into the school. We looked out again, and we saw maybe 15 to 20 state police cars pulling into the school. We reminded everyone that we had our First Amendment right to peacefully protest and to stay nonviolent, which we did. After several attempts to get us to go back to class, we told the officers that we had a right to be out here and we weren't causing any trouble. The officers evidently didn't like our response, so they got someone to pull up the school bus near where we were standing. And they started grabbing up the black students and loading them on the bus. What started out as a peaceful protest turned into a full-scale melee by the police treatment of the black students. They treated us as though we were criminals. We had not broken into windows, destroyed any school property, or assaulted anyone. You see, on February 24, 1969, the United States Supreme Court recognized the right of young people, the free speech for young people at school. What they said in that ruling was this: you have a right to assemble, even as a student. Students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the school gate. There you go. Gotta get my sheet right. But anyway, I want to say we disobeyed him in one way. So I'm not going to say we did wrong, because back in the 70s, everybody protested. You had students walking out of college, everybody protested the Vietnam War. All of those things were going on. Every state in the United States had protesting. That was the thing in the 70s. So what I'm saying to you today is, even the students here at Patrick Henry High, and I think Steve's going to cover this, but in 1971, the year before we protested, white students got up and walked out because they elected a black student as the SCA president. So they were protesting that. Now, I'm going to say this: no arrest. Now, Lane High School in Charlottesville did the exact same thing that we did. Probably the same week it happened. White students walked out of the auditorium. The students came back, black students came back and locked themselves in the auditorium the next day. But the difference between what happened with us and Lane, they handled everything in-house. Nobody got arrested. Nobody got charged with anything. So, I don't call any names, but it was handled wrong. You know, you can't have two sets of justices. You can't have justice for the white students and then a different justice for the black students. We should all be equal. And that's what happened on that day. Now, I want to say, and I want to state this, and I want to make it clear. A lot of people thought that we were protesting against the white students. I can tell you emphatically, no. We were not protesting. Matter of fact, we were in the class in 1972, and Malcolm, Steve, and I. And I'm going to tell you, we've been friends. Our class just finished our 50th class reunion in November. 50 years. And you should have seen us there. We were like little kids. You know, everybody hugging up, eating and stuff. And some of them were still on that high because it was so good. It was just that good. So I'm a little biased, right? Because I think the class of 72 was probably the best class that ever came out of this school. I'm just saying, I'm telling you, they were the best class because the classmates, how many classmates do you, after 50-some years, you're still friends with? 60. See? we all are still friends. And when we get together, it's like time has stopped. You should have seen it. We were like little kids. And Mrs. Wright, who taught art up here, she's 92 years old. She came to our class reunion. And she came up to me, she said, "Man, give me the microphone, give me the microphone." So I took the microphone, I said, "It was right." And I said, "Look at her, she's 92 years old." And then I said, "Oh no, 92 years young." She said, "Oh, that means I'm over the hill." So she grabs the microphone and she tells the student, we had an absolute ball. I told the students, because I was the DJ, I told the students, I said, "Look, get your phones and video this and put it on Facebook, and let's show the world what this little old school up in Ashland can do, where blacks and whites can come together and enjoy each other's company." And that's what they did. If you go on Facebook and look at some of the pictures, you would never know that we've got the racial problems going on today that we have. That's why I say the class of '72 is probably the closest. I'm biased. But anyway, in closing, I want to say this because this has been on the hearts and minds of our students for 51 years. And we're going to get closure today because the truth has been told. Now, I want to say this incident has been a burden on the hearts and minds of those black students who witnessed or were a part of the treatment that day. So much so that they will not talk about it. They don't want to think about it because of the violence and the lies that were told by the administration. Take a moment and think. If we had fought back that day, a lot of us would have not been here to tell this story. We would have been on the wrong end of the billy club, or even worse, we would have been the target of a stray bullet. Instead of being taken to jail, we could have been taken to the morgue. Hopefully, by telling this story today, it will ease the pain and suffering of those who have carried this burden for 51 years. Now is the time for healing to begin. To glory be to God, for the truth has set us free. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Our second storyteller is Rebecca Doggett Bray. Becky grew up in the Doswell area and attended Doswell and Washington Henry elementary schools. She graduated from Lee Davis High School in 1968 and went on to receive an undergraduate and graduate degrees from Virginia Commonwealth University and a law degree from the University of Richmond. She taught in Henrico County and Hanover County Public Schools and then practiced law for a while. Becky came back to be assistant principal at several Hanover County schools. In 2005, she retired after serving as principal of Henry Clay and Rural Point Elementary Schools. Becky co-authored with Dr. Lloyd Jones of A History of Education in Hanover County, Virginia, 1778 to 2008. Here's Becky's story.
Thank you. I lived in Doswell, Virginia for the first 9 years of my life, from 1950 to 1959. My grandmother had a large farm that ran along Route 30 from the North Anna River up to the railroad tracks where King's Dominion now stands. Her home and several outbuildings stood at the top of the hill just as you crossed into Hanover County from Caroline. 4 of my grandmother's sons, including my father, built their homes on sections of her land going toward the railroad tracks on each side of Route 30, so I was surrounded by cousins during those years. When I was old enough, I used to ride my bicycle over to the Meadow Farm across the North Anna into Caroline, where the Virginia State Fairgrounds now stand. I rode to the stables at the Meadow Farm, and the stable hand let me pet the horses, including the famous horse, First Landing. That was before the time of the more famous Secretariat and River Ridge. They made their home at the Meadow Farm, too. I also love to ride my bike over to the Meadow Pond during summer vacation to swim with the children whose father was the farm manager. Camptown Races was held at the Meadow Farm back then, and my family always went to that with a big picnic lunch. My cousins and I loved to walk to Donnell's store next to the railroad tracks in downtown Dawsville. Since we only had one car, which my father drove to work in Richmond each day, my grandmother would drive us to Ashland once a week to the A&P grocery store, to Cross Brothers, and to Lightfoot's Bakery. On weekends, we sometimes went to the Rose Bowl Drive-In on Friday or Saturday night, and to the White House Restaurant on Route 1 for lunch. On a few special occasions, my family would go to dinner at the Wigwam on Route 1. My cousins, the Starks, lived on Duncan Street in Ashland, and I would spend a week with them in the summer. I thought it was so great to walk to all the places in Ashland. We went roller skating at the War Memorial. We could buy a 5-cent ice cream cone at the highest ice cream store, or have ice cream float at Hughes's drugstore. We enjoyed going to the matinee movie at the Ashland Theater and walking to nearby homes of the Stark children's friends to play. I attended Dawsville School 1st through 4th grade. The principal, Lena Williams, was also my 1st grade teacher. Our class was in the auditorium. When I was in 4th grade, the 4th and 5th graders were in the same classroom, and our teacher alternated between teaching both grades throughout the day. 6th and 7th graders shared one classroom as well. I remember our bus ride was very long, as there was only one bus for the whole Dawsville district. On the ride, we passed the building and grounds where the black children went to school, which was located at the corner of Route 1 and Route 30. I sometimes saw those children playing ball or jump rope outside as we passed. We went to downtown Richmond once a year to see Santa and Miller and Rhodes. We also went to other downtown stores such as Tallhammer's, Woolworth's, and Hofheimer's shoe store. We rode with my father on his way to work, so we had to wait upstairs in Miller and Rhodes until the store opened. Sometimes my father would take me to the Richmond Braves baseball game. My father played on the Ashland baseball team, and Dutch Hobblog was his coach. My mother, sister, and I went to those games, some of which were around Richmond. Much to my chagrin, the 1950s bring back memories of the minstrel shows at Dawsville School and TV programs like The Little Rascals and Amos and Andy. My best memory of black people with whom I came in contact in Dawsville was when my mother worked in Richmond for a year or so, and a lovely black lady named Queen Mines came to our house as my caregiver and our housekeeper. I remember that she would fix me a wonderful hot lunch, but while I sat down at the kitchen table to eat, she'd have her lunch at the kitchen counter, even though I asked her to please come sit and eat with me. She said, "Becky, that's not proper." Of course, I didn't understand, and it made me sad. My family went to Queen's house just before Christmas, and I was excited to meet her children and take them Christmas presents. My family moved to Mechanicsville in 1959, and I attended Washington Henry through the 7th grade. In 7th grade, our classrooms were in 3 trailers, and the classes were crowded. We played competitive sports in the upper grades of elementary school. We had a girls' softball team, and we played against Beaver Dam Elementary and some of the other county schools. Lee Davis housed 8th through 12th grades when I went there in the 1963-64 school year. This was the first year Hanover schools were more widely integrated. 6 black students were enrolled at Lee Davis that year. I never thought anything of this, as it was a new school for me too. However, it was disturbing to learn that those students couldn't ride the school bus with the white students, even though the school bus went by their homes. They had to ride a bus to Gandy School and be transported from Gandy to Lee Davis, which, as their parents protested, was ridiculous, since the reason they had petitioned to come to Lee Davis in the first place was because of the distance from their East End homes to Gandy and Ashland. My sister was 4 years ahead of me at Lee Davis, and she said she remembers only one black student attended the school when she was in either 10th or 11th grade. She said it embarrassed her that he was taunted by the white boys in his class. During my years at Lee Davis, the black students fit in with the other students. There were no known incidents of disruption or prejudice. One of those students with whom I became friends performed with her sisters in the school's annual talent show back in 1967. Their act was a rendition of the then famous singing quartet known as the Supremes. These girls were so good that they got a standing ovation from the audience. Attending VCU in 1968 to 72 raised my awareness of the civil rights movement. However, at VCU, blacks and whites got along well, and actually we had a black student government president. There were a lot of hippies back then at VCU, and I remember some incidents of streaking at a couple of the games. Those years were certainly an interesting time to be in college. It was at VCU that I met Mary Waddy, who many of you may know. Mary is a retired Hanover teacher. Mary and I had several classes together at VCU, and at the time she worked at Janie Porter Barrett School for Girls in Hanover. I went with a small group to visit with the girls at that school at Mary's invitation. It was a rewarding experience and very interesting to talk with those girls. In the late 60s and 70s, I often felt awkward about the fact that there were places that still weren't inviting for black people. Our church had an annual Youth Sunday where the youth group members took over the roles of church leaders. I was asked to be the preacher for one of the Youth Sunday evening services. I spoke about those awkward feelings and mentioned my friend Mary and how it was very unsettling to me that I didn't feel I could invite her to my church. I think I raised a few eyebrows at that evening service. In 1972, after graduating from VCU, my first year of teaching was at Pearson's Corner in 4th grade, and I had 36 children in my class. I believe 7 were black, and everyone got along. All these students were so sweet and a great deal of fun. My youngest brother was in 4th grade at Mechanicsville Elementary that first year I taught 4th grade at Pearson's. He played Blue Star football with some of my black students. They thought that was so funny, but they loved me to come to their games. Most shocking and sad memories from the 60s were the assassinations of 3 great leaders of our civil rights movement, President John F. Kennedy, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., then Senator Robert F. Kennedy. It was very difficult for a happy-go-lucky teenager to try to comprehend, and of course never forget seeing and hearing about those horrific tragedies on TV news, listening to Walter Cronkite. And that's my story.
Thank you, Becky. Next, we'll hear from Malcolm King. Malcolm was born in Ashland, the only child of parents who were born and raised in the western part of Hanover County. He attended John M. Gandy School until 1969, when he moved to Patrick Henry High School following the court-mandated desegregation of Hanover County Public Schools. He is an Army veteran, holds undergraduate and graduate degrees from Virginia Commonwealth University, and worked in state government for 41 years with the Department of Juvenile Justice and the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. He currently lives just up the road with his wife and son, still, and always a Hanover resident. Malcolm.
Thank you, Anthony. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
The civil rights era was brought on by the fact that black Americans were being caught in a vice grip of segregation, discrimination, and economic inequality. Hanover County was being squeezed tight in that grip. And that was during the years of 1954 through 1968, as it has been described. But my civil rights era was from 1966 through 1972. At 12 years old in 1966, I was just old enough to process what was different in the black and white community. The culture in Hanover County was very separate and very unequal at that time. Now, not all white people at that time were segregationists, but the laws of the land made it difficult for them to be true to themselves. All laws, rules, and regulations were segregated and controlled by groups of white people, mostly men, that held the viewpoint that society should be separated along racial lines. And there were so many unequal and demeaning unwritten rules. During that time, it was difficult for African Americans to find meaningful, well-paying jobs and my mother, my aunts, my uncles, and other family members and neighbors did domestic work in white family homes, taking care of children, cooking meals, cooking everyday meals, washing clothes, and babysitting children from sometimes infancy to young adults. I remember my mother telling me stories that a lot of her friends, she and a lot of her friends were unable to go to the Millen Roads and Tallhammers in Richmond and try on clothes because they were African American. They would look in the catalog and see clothes that they wanted and would get the women that they worked for to go to those stores and try the clothes on, buy them, and bring them back. If they fit, then the black ladies would buy them from the women that they worked for. My mother was a very proud woman and said that she was not going to do that because she was not going to wear clothes that someone that she worked for had worn. My neighborhood was occupied along racial lines. I lived in Ashland on Sneed Street until young adulthood. Part of Sneed Street was a black community and part was a white community, and it was divided at Wester Street. When it rained hard in the summer, the black community's yards, the ditches and all would flood incredibly, and the mosquitoes would fight us like a natural man. But I cannot understand to this day why the white community's areas did not flood. And Sunday morning was the most segregated hour in Hanover County. As hard as times were during that era, spirituality told the black folk that we would be able to overcome. And during that time, black Americans that I knew did not go to therapists, they didn't go to marriage counselors, they didn't go to psychiatrists or substance abuse counselors, they went to the preacher. The preacher was the unofficial leader in the community during that time. But nowhere, absolutely nowhere, was segregation more present than in the Hanover school system. Dr. Martin Luther King said once, and I quote, "Education is one of the vital tools the Negro needs in order to advance, and yet it has been denied him by the devices of segregation and manipulations with qualities." And that was exactly how education played out in Hanover. Schools for white children, it seemed, was spread out in different areas to accommodate the white neighborhoods. But I went to school in 1961, and the only school that I knew about was John M. Gandy. And John M. Gandy appeared to be the only school that black children could attend. And at that time, John M. Gandy was an elementary school, and it was the equivalent of a middle school, and was the only high school for black students in Hanover. Students from the western part of Hanover, far western part of Hanover, black students, would ride the bus past Patrick Henry to go to John M. Gandy. The only reason was because black children and white children were prohibited from studying and learning together because of the color of their skin. During that time, the NAACP fought that very, very aggressively. And through their efforts in using the Pupil Placement Board and the Freedom of Choice program, between 1963 and 1965, about 19 black students transferred to all white schools. Now I mean all white. I'm not talking about predominantly. It was all white. And no white children transferred to Gandy. If the segregation in the school system was going to happen, it was going to be done through the work and on the backs of our black parents. The NAACP in 1964 sent the Hanover County School Board a letter saying, we want full integration. The Hanover County School Board said, the schools are already integrated. We got 19 in there, we good. But during that time, the 1968 Supreme Court was really getting annoyed with this type of model in the school system. And this was just not in Hanover County, but it was throughout the state of Virginia. After very much legal wrangling, in 1969, the Hanover school system was forced to fully integrate all public schools by the Supreme Court. Although Hanover County School Board was finally in compliance with the federal law, it missed the fact that two completely different cultures were now living and learning together for the first time ever. School integration was totally foreign to blacks and whites. No one was told what to expect, what the possible problems would be, although we had a good idea, and how to integrate not only the bodies, but also the two cultures. I attended Patrick Henry in 1969 with Matt. I didn't have any obvious problems, probably because I obeyed my mother and father to the letter. They told me when they found out that the schools was integrated, they told me, don't go up there messing with them white people. You keep your mouth shut. And that's pretty much what I did. I was quiet as a church mouse. In 1972, though, I came out of my bag. I had the audacity and the unmitigated gall to run for historian of the school's council, and I won. And I was appointed the Human Relations Committee chairman, and we decided that we would put on and sponsor a Black History program, the first ever in the school. We would have speeches and different discussions about the black culture. We also, as Matt talked about, discussed having the Black National Anthem being sung. The all-white administration prohibited the singing of that because they thought it might cause problems. As black students, we knew that the anthem represented the very fabric of the black race. And the white administration didn't understand that and wasn't interested in trying to learn. They were just trying to get through the day and keep the lid on things. And as Matt has so plainly but painfully detailed what happened after that. Did the students that sung the song disobey the authority of the school at that time? Yes. But could the school leaders have handled the singing of the anthem and the nonviolent protest with a more even hand and with more understanding? Absolutely. There are some that would say, and some did say, that the problems on that day were caused by a bunch of arrogant, disobeying black kids defying a principle on February the 18th, which led to 37 out-of-control black kids being taken to jail. But I don't think it was that simple. The problem just didn't start that day. It was a slow burn. The problem began back in 1964, when the Hanover County School Board told the NAACP that the schools were already integrated. The fuse was lit in 1969 when the Supreme Court told Hanover County, you've got to integrate fully. And the eruption happened on February 18th when the students sung the song. The aftermath shook Hanover County to its core. There was a lot of fear, tension, and unrest during that time, during that particular time and during that day. Now you have to remember that there wasn't any body cam, there wasn't any cell phones. Word of mouth traveled. And we all know how word of mouth traveled. You add a little bit here, you add a little bit there, you add a little bit there, and a nonviolent protest turned into a full-scale riot by the time it got from Patrick Henry to Ashland. During that time, it was, as Matt has indicated, it was very, very difficult for the African American. And a lot of students were wounded because of the protests and how it was handled. But time does not heal all wounds. But what time does is allow us to reflect on our wounds, find out and understand why those wounds happen, and helps us to move on from it. And yes, we had our we had our reunion on November the 5th of last year, and we had a large black and white attendance. Classmates enjoying themselves, laughing, dancing, and we breaking bread together and catching up on life experiences. Hanover County has changed tremendously in 51 years, but we still have so much more work to do. Change is difficult and is long-term, but I have to believe that the events of February the 18th through the February the 22nd of 1972 is one of the flashpoints in our history that helps us to continue to promote positive change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Malcolm. Our fourth speaker is Patricia Leonard Higgins. Tricia grew up at Hickory Oaks Farm and attended Hanover County Public Schools, graduating from Patrick Henry in 1971. She went on to UVA, where she received both undergraduate and graduate degrees. She stayed on in Charlottesville, working as a nurse practitioner for 40 years. She now lives, once again, at Hickory Oaks Farm. She has 2 children and one, quote, precious grandson. Tricia, thank you.
Thank you. It's a really wonderful privilege to be a part of this panel. I'm the eldest daughter in a family of 5 children. I was born in 1953, which makes me a member of the class of 1971, which I'd like to nominate for at least the second best. And some of you are here. We all grew up on a farm that had been purchased in the mid-1940s by our paternal grandfather, who lived in Richmond in the same house where our father was born. I never knew that grandfather. He died in 1951. He bought the property in Hanover, which is not very far at all from where we're sitting right now, because he wanted to be a part-time farmer. And before his death, he asked our dad, I think he told our dad, that he wanted him to live and work on the farm. So our mother and father did just that, and all of us grew up in the old 1880s farmhouse that was already there. And after more than 40 years away, my husband and I are back there living again. Growing up out in the country, most of our time was spent on the farm or at school, beginning with Ms. Smith's kindergarten, and I have at least one classmate from kindergarten here tonight. Then Henry Clay Elementary, and also at church at Duncan Memorial United Methodist Church. Joined the Brownies and the Girl Scouts, and I've come to really appreciate the effort that it took to get us all around. It took some planning. It was a great thing when my older brother got his driver's license, and he became our taxi. And not just for us, but sometimes for another family of 5 kids, the Pretties, who didn't live very far away. We all shared that taxi. During my teenage years, I did a lot of babysitting. Probably. In fact, I happen to know for some of you who are here tonight. But I think my friends thought it was, who enjoyed more being at the pool during the summertime, thought it was funny that I really loved being on the my grandfather's 1951 Ford 8N tractor mowing the fields at the farm. My father would pay me $10 for each multi-acre field. And the hours spent on that tractor I recall as being really some of my best thinking times, hatching plans for my own life. And I'm now the proud owner of that old Ford tractor. Our nearest neighbors who shared a property line with us were the William Winston family. Now their road is known as Winston Estates Lane. They were farmers also, and my father would sometimes borrow or lend some farm implements to them, and would sometimes seek advice. Other neighbors on that road were also Mr. and Mrs. John Bradley, known to us growing up as Jack and Nell. I don't know how my mother actually came to know Mrs. Bradley, but at some point with 5 children in that old farmhouse, my mother needed some help. So she needed some help with cleaning up after us and all kinds of tasks. So Mrs. Bradley began coming every Wednesday, and that became a very important and regular presence in our home. And as children, we really loved her. The Bradleys had a daughter who worked in nursing, and I'd forgotten all about this as I grew up and headed off to college. 3 years after finishing nursing school myself and marrying, my husband and I showed up at an emergency room in Charlottesville with me in labor with our first child, who's sitting out in the audience with you tonight. And who do you think, this was 5 o'clock in the morning, who do you think at the end of her night shift came down with a wheelchair and took us up to the labor and delivery area to be admitted? But the Bradley's daughter, I'll never forget that. It was in Charlottesville. A little bit later, my mother packed me and that baby girl into her car and drove us over to see Mrs. Bradley because she had told my mother that she really, really wanted to see that baby. I recently read that when she passed away, Miss Bradley was in her late 90s, and I know some of you knew her, and remember her well as I do. Something else, one more note about the farm where we grew up is as the result of long research on the part of several persons, including Professor Reber Dunkel at Randolph-Macon College, it was determined that a portion of the property on the farm had at an earlier time been owned by the Reverend John Preston Clark, who founded a number of churches in Hanover County during his lifetime. John Gordon, I don't know if he's here tonight, also was a very important player in all of this. It's believed that the Reverend Clark's grave, along with his wife's, Lucy Ann Winston, and others, were discovered in a field that was part of our mother's property at the time. And on the edge of Winston Estates Lane, there was a wonderful dedication of a historical marker at Abner Baptist Church in 2014, which I was able to attend along with my mother and some other family members. In November 1963, I was in the 5th grade, Mrs. Rainey's class. What a wonderful teacher she was. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and like others have said, we heard Walter Cronkite's voice on the loudspeaker that was turned on to chronicle that terrible event. And in 1968, the assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. followed by Robert Kennedy in June, just really made things feel utterly catastrophic. I think we all suffered definitely a level of shock and probably some PTSD during those times, no matter what our skin color was. There was an effort at our church with a special intergenerational Sunday school class that was held in the fellowship hall to recognize the events of the civil rights movement with music and readings. And I distinctly recall when we began singing "We Shall Overcome," an adult member of my own family stood up and abruptly walked out. Like everyone else here, a lot of memories are involved with the desegregation of the schools, the high schools. There's something that happened that I remember that made me feel very resentful, actually. And it's when the amazing John M. Gandy High School marching band was not allowed to continue as it had been for so long. Anyone who had ever attended the Ashland Rescue Squad parade or any of the Richmond area parades knew how absolutely fantastic they were. We understood that it was the white parents who didn't let this happen. And now I wish I'd been brave enough to be more outspoken about that and other things. And speaking of being courageous, one of my many classmates at Patrick Henry was Ruth Giles, who later was also my classmate at the University of Virginia. And at the time, UVA was going through a gender-related desegregation of its own by allowing women to enter as undergraduates. Black students, all men, were admitted beginning in 1955, although those numbers were small and remained so. Women were not admitted until 1970 in small numbers, the first 2 years to kind of test things out. The color guard tonight really made me remember this. So entering in 1971, Ruth and I were in a real minority of women. Especially in retrospect, that was quite a significant thing, and it took some moxie, which I only had a little bit of, but it took particularly special courage for Ruth, which I admire greatly. Last of all, for me, although some of my memories are a little bit vague, and I grew up in a sheltered situation, in my professional life, I've been impacted by many amazing people and eye-opening experiences, and I hope I've been paying better attention. At the end of my career, before I retired, my boss, a most wonderful woman, was the finest possible role model. She is now 80 years old. She's a graduate of North Carolina A&T. She was an Army nurse who completed her service at the rank of captain and then went on to get her master's in public health. And during her college years, she participated in nonviolence training secretly in the basement of a church and was one of the Greensboro protesters at the Woolworth's lunch counter sit-ins. She told me that her mother constantly worried that she wouldn't come home at night, and that is true courage. And the state of North Carolina has a historical marker that I know you can't see back there, but I'm going to put it here for my panel mates that commemorates that sit-in February 1st, 1960. She was an amazing woman, is an amazing woman. And very finally, it's important that I add that being a longtime resident of Charlottesville, my children's hometown, like Ashland is mine, that the August 11th and 12th, 2017 Unite the Right rally there with the Torch March the night before truly rocked me and many, many others to the core. It still does, and especially whenever I hear Charlottesville as the name of an event rather than the city where I lived so long. So yes, we have a great deal of progress. We've made a lot of progress since the civil rights era began, but we do still have a long, long way to go together. Thank you.
Thank you, Tricia. Mary Jane Davenport G will be the next speaker. Mary Jane grew up in Elmont and first attended a private segregated kindergarten in Ashland, then moved on to John M. Gandy School through the 8th grade. She chose to attend Patrick Henry under the new integration system. Mary Jane had served as secretary of the Hanover County Orange County and Prince Edward County NAACP. She received a bachelor's degree from Lynchburg College and retired after many years with the Department of Correction and the Department of Correction Education. Mary Jane and her husband currently live in Pamplin, Virginia. Welcome, Mary Jane.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I was born in 1951, the only child of Mary Frances Miller Davenport and Junius Leroy Davenport Jr., and I fondly recall growing up at Elmont playing with cousins and friends and a few white kids. I was a member of First Baptist Church Elmont and was baptized in Echo Lake in Henrico. There are lots of stories and wonderful elders and loving role models that I wish I had time to talk about today. Although poor, I was very blessed. And when I became a probation officer later in life, I realized just how much I had been blessed. I had two loving parents. We ate dinner together at the kitchen table every night. We had big family meals after church each Sunday with delicious homemade yeast bowls, so I can taste them. And my uncles would tell stories of their growing up. And my dad woke me up to a home-cooked breakfast every morning before school, and that man made the best waffles. My dad was a plasterer and later worked with sheetrock out of necessity. He used to amaze me with being able to walk on stilts and make beautiful designs on ceilings. My mom was a domestic worker, but she only worked for folks who treated her with respect. I recall a couple of instances when she quit jobs because that respect was not given. 3 white families that she worked for stand out in my memory: Dr. William D. Covington and his wife Jose and their 2 sons. The George and Cornelia Olivers, who were professors at Randolph-Macon College and later Mary Washington. I used to play with their daughters, Mary and Bird. Then there was O.K. and Jessie Lee Campbell, who also worked in education. Jessie Lee was a high school counselor at Patrick Henry. The Campbells were so forward-thinking that they paid into Social Security while my mother worked for them, which became an asset in her later years. My folks loved working outside. I did and do not. And they had a garden and a beautiful landscape yard that people would stop to admire. Mom canned veggies and made the flakiest pie crust. She tried in vain to teach me. She could crochet and sew anything she put her mind to, and I did learn how to sew from her. It was her love of piano that caused me to begin piano lessons at an early age. My mom would insist that anyone who visited our home would have to listen to me play piano. It was so embarrassing. My piano lessons were on Saturdays in Richmond, and I loved to go to my Uncle George's Tasty Bake Shop on 2nd Street afterwards for cinnamon buns. I attended a private kindergarten in Ashland, and then John and Gandy School until I decided to take advantage of the Freedom of Choice plan and attend the white school, Patrick Henry, in 1966. My parents did not decide for me. I remember I felt I had to do so because I was active in the NAACP Youth Council and was very aware of the sacrifices others had made, even giving their lives for civil rights. Although we had excellent teachers at Gandy, I was all too aware of the lack of resources, hand-me-down books, school buses that often broke down. So I sacrificed this familiarity of going to Gandy. When I made that choice, I was criticized by some kids at Gandy, and I was asked not to go by one of the teachers who wanted me to stay because I was playing piano for the Gandy course. While attending Gandy, I was picked up in front of my house by a school bus. The one thing I want to say about the Gandy school bus is that we were expected to behave on it. This was not enforced when I attended Patrick Henry. I was not sent any instructions as to what bus to take or anything, so I naively stood at my front door waiting for the school bus to stop for me the first day. It didn't. My mom got a white neighbor to drive me to school. By the way, I was the only black on my bus. When I returned home, I asked to have the bus stop at my house, and it did. Although apparently, that was something that some kids on the bus took issue with. From then on, my rides to and from school were replete with harassment from one particular white boy and some of his comrades. Spitballs and name-calling became the norm as I practiced my best nonviolent response. But I recall one white girl on the bus who did not seem to mind my sitting with her. She was older. I wish I remembered her name and could thank her now for her kindness to me. As an only child, I read a lot, and she turned me on to the writings of Carson McCullers. She loaned me books, and I read them. I even did a theme paper in English Lit on Carson McCullers. Another Patrick Henry student, whose name I do not recall, learned that I loved cats and gave me a beautiful Persian kitty that I named Fluffy. And my family fell in love with Fluffy. Fluffy was the only cat ever allowed inside our house, and Fluffy used to sleep with me. Except for the harassment of the bus rides, I recall feeling invisible at Patrick Henry. There were definite cliques. Even when I joined the choir and attended honor society meetings, I was never made to feel a part. I even accompanied the choir on the organ at some white church on Route 54, when the choir sang the Hallelujah chorus. A teacher talked me into continuing to take French classes when I wanted to take another language. Later I learned I was needed to keep the class going, and the reward was that some of the white kids got to go to France. But I knew so much French. Listen to this. I took the SATs in French. And I got to skip 1 year to require foreign language in college. At Patrick Henry, I took driver's ed, and my driver instructor was Coach Charlie Bob White, who taught me sociology at Patrick Henry. It was in that class that I decided to take up sociology in college. My dreams of being a pathologist have been dashed horribly in chemistry class. Later, I met up with him again in corrections because he was a well-respected chief of probation and parole in Richmond. But I can still remember him chewing gum to stay calm in that car while I was trying to learn how to drive. And going into all the curves too fast. I still do that. Anyway, while in sociology class, I was befriended by a white girl who was not afraid to have a black girl as a good friend. Her name is Rachel Plaster. Rachel deserves a chapter in whatever book I'm going to end up writing because she was so much fun. Interestingly, many years later, also in the Department of Corrections, I met Michael Wright when I was a probation officer in Fairfax, and he was a visiting manager. As we chatted, we slowly realized that we were both Hanover raised and 1969 graduates from Patrick Henry, and had never known each other. I remember later retrieving my yearbook to see who the heck he was. Anyway, he became a good friend and a co-worker. A similar thing happened with me when I attended one of the class reunions many years later. I met and have become good friends with Kathy Ellis, who's here today. But most of the women at the reunion remained distant, just like in the 60s. When I graduated, I was awarded a $1,000 scholarship from Overnight Transportation Company. One of those distant classmates talked with me for the very first time that day. I left Patrick Henry feeling somewhat angry and resentful about many of my experiences there, but it prepared me for my next journey, Lynchburg College. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Jane. The last storyteller today is Ashland's own mayor, Steve Trivett. Steve graduated from Patrick Henry High School in 1972 and has lived in Ashland since 1983. He and his wife have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. All were or are currently attend Hanover County Schools. Steve holds a bachelor's degree and has worked in home building, human services, community services, and has worked with youth. He has been retired since 2020. Steve.
Thank you. Just remember, I'm not the mayor today. just another of those wonderful graduates in class of 72. All right. I grew up in Elmont. Yeah, I'll talk about that later. I grew up in Elmont, down a side road off Cedar Lane. That began in 1960 after we said goodbye to Richmond and hello to Hanover. White flight? Don't know. I was 6 and mostly focused on exploring a new home. It had previously been the home of Judge Bazille. As a kid, I knew his name, but I've learned along the way that the year before we moved, Bazille had ruled against Richard and Mildred Loving in their interracial marriage case. However, the case progressed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which struck down Bazille and related segregationist law within Loving v. Virginia. Even so, that spirit of separation was widespread, included with schooling. During the school year, 5 days a week, twice a day, a bus traveled our dirt road. It was yellow like mine, but not mine. That bus served the black kids next door. That was the family of Mr. Charles Winston. My siblings and I walked to Cedar Lane for our bus. I don't recall ever asking my parents about that different bus or a different school either. And strangely, even jealousy didn't prompt me to ask why the black students got door-to-door service and we had to walk up and down that road. I know now they weren't getting any luxury. It was that spirit of separation, another layer of division to limit friction and friendship between black and white neighbors. I was clueless that segregation was normal. Yep, dreadfully normal. One vivid memory of that other bus, it ran over our dog Taffy. But no racial fuss over that. Dogs that chase vehicles have short lifespans. Segregation lingered in neighborhoods too. There were only a few times we as black and white children played together. No spoken words forbid it, but something did. One time we did play together and an incident erupted, but not about race. We were gathered in our front yard. Young and foolish, we thought a rock battle might be fun. We split into 2, and I'll say very modern teams. Each was co-ed and desegregated with my brother now on opposite sides. My older sisters must have been doing homework or watching Dialing for Dollars, or they'd have stopped our fun. Well, that dangerous kind of fun fizzled when I peeked up, and bam! I went screaming toward the house with blood flowing down over my eyes. Everybody scattered. Again, no racial issue. My brother Herb confessed he'd heaved that stone. Thank you, Herb. No, you're back there. He and I had some explaining to do that night, but overall, I don't recall much talk in our home about race, unless it was something in the news. I suspect our older sisters had trailblazed a bit through those small steps of desegregation predating our time at PH. Sandra told me how she answered our father on, how do you feel about going to school with black students? She responded, I don't care if students are pink, we can still learn together. Deanna mentioned one of her few black classmates in those years, Chastine King. One day in her English class, as they studied Romeo and Juliet, Deanna read as Juliet, Chastine as Romeo. Shakespeare in black and white. Raised some eyebrows, maybe. My guess, a teacher tried to open minds. About that time, we started going to Patrick Henry football games. At games, it seemed everyone was cheering for all the Patriots, white and black ones together. Besides sports, another force was bringing people together then, music. For a season, our mom was displeased over my sisters listening to that music, Motown. But as soul music infiltrated our house by radio, whatever had troubled Mom drifted away as she heard black artists such as Johnny Mathis singing songs such as It's Not For Me To Say, and I almost want to sing Chances Are. Well, when words and melodies blend together, the common themes of life through music, chances are old walls can melt. In '68, a singer named Dion came out with Abraham, Martin, and John. It's on YouTube. I listened and thought about that song and its message as TV news shared stories and images of Kennedy's, Martin Luther King, and Vietnam. The world felt somber and kind of distant, yet music was drawing the world closer and making me a little less clueless. Walls of separation stood, but I sensed they were on the way down, but not for everybody. Sophomore year, a classmate and I, we'll call him Pete, decided to try out for JV baseball. Tryouts were after school, and Hanover had an activity bus in those days to get everybody home. I didn't know then, but Pete's dad had been a poor role model in race relations. Somehow Pete must have given hint of that on one of those bus rides. He was drawing unfriendly attention to the two of us from a couple of our mostly black co-riders, and I wasn't as tall then as I am now. I went into shut up and look ahead mode. Pete, nope. Instead, he doubled down with, my brothers will take care of you, amping up tension and drawing some company toward our seat. Then, a firm, clear voice spoke up. Sit down and everybody get along. That welcome voice also came from someone having the stature to enforce it. Thank you, Mr. John Gordon. Always a leader, right? Always a leader. I didn't make the team either, like the rock battle, no arm. Matt and I became teammates on the JV football team in the 10th grade. You know, we both grew up in Melmont, and evidently Mary Jane too. Matt and I, same age, but if not for that year's school desegregation, our friendship may not have occurred. Yeah, and I've got about the reunion. I'll skip that. I'll just say that music, again, was a backdrop for an enjoyable night, but sports was replaced with food. My junior year, I ran for treasurer of the SCA, right along with Malcolm, running for that SCA group. In February '71, there was an assembly for us candidates. I'd never talked before a crowd, and the gym looked packed. I was plenty nervous, and I'd heard some rumors of discontent over the election, but I didn't know any details. Now, the walkout was the following week. This was the day of the assembly where we could present ourselves as candidates. And so the election hadn't taken place yet. By the time my turn at the podium came, I jumbled up my note cards, my first public speech. And I just stood there dumbstruck. Stammering a moment about being treasurer, I just then said, you know, I talked about trusting one another being more important than the election, and slithered on back to my seat. As a candidate for SCA president went up, black students began walking out calmly with order, but it stunned to silence. Many, most, all, honestly I don't remember how many of the black students, but a lot of black students gathered outside while those of us inside just sat looking at each other. I don't recall any adult going to the podium to face that blank stare audience. Then a black student who'd gone out came back in. A senior, James Quash, stepped behind the podium and he spoke, sincere from his heart, and his words reset the whole assembly to where it closed with a standing ovation. For me, that day wasn't a day of havoc, fear, or separation. It was an organized testimony to the disunity of the times. End result, people grew more aware and more determined to work together to, as Mr. Gordon said, to get along. The next September, as a senior, I joined the Patrick Henry Human Relations Committee with that same old purpose of becoming less clueless. You know, looking back through these years and bring myself back forward, I can't say that I've always walked a perfect path, but I think what helped things work out from time to time was a few things I learned. Didn't have a strong church upbringing, but some things sunk in. So I found in life that things work out better if I walked a path, and on one side of that path was a little Sunday school song. Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, red or yellow, black or white, all are precious in his sight. And I reasoned that if Jesus loved them as children, he must love everybody as adults too. So I was ever suspicious of bigotry. The other border, the golden rule, treating people the way I wanted to be treated. There's a blessing in living that way. Now, like I say, I've stepped out of those borders more than once or twice. And one night, I was walking down Cedar Lane to the Elmont Ruijten Center. I'm thinking I was 13, 14, something like that. It was a mile or so, no street lights, definitely no sidewalks. You walked in the road. I heard a car speeding up behind me, so I jumped in the ditch. As it blew by, a voice called out, "Get out of the road, you," racial epithet. I know name calling was wrong, but I called back, "You honky." Then I laughed to myself and walked on, ever working to become a little less clueless. Thank you for the opportunity today.
Thank you, Steve. Let us all show our panel how much we appreciate them. To the members of the panel, we thank you for all of your stories. I know that you didn't have much time to share and tell all of them, and there was much more to them that you wanted to tell. To the audience, I encourage you all to think about your stories that you have to tell and that you have growing up, about the different experiences and changing times you had. We encourage you to write them down, to record them in whatever way you can. We also ask that you talk to the elders in your family to find out what their stories are, to copy their stories and share their stories, to record their stories, because all of these stories need to be shared. They need to be passed on to future generations. We all share a part of our past and need to pass on to the next generation how that past looked into us and how it affected us. And now I'd like to call on Dr. Jamelle Wilson to sum up what we've heard today and to put it into perspective, to talk to us about where it all fits into Hanover's history. Jamelle.
Well, good evening, everyone. I am so happy to be with you this evening and to see, even though the lights are dim, such a wonderful group of people who've decided that for 2 hours or so on a Sunday afternoon, there was no better place for you to be than to hear our stories, to hear our collective stories, our individual stories. Chimamanda Adichie said, "Our histories cling to us. We are shaped by where we come from." So over the last hour and 40 minutes or so, 47 minutes, we have heard collectively 355 years of experience. And the richness of the stories that we heard, I found myself sitting there thinking, and feeling in some ways weight, feeling in other ways buoyancy, permission to move forward, to think differently, but nevertheless a weight. Because what these 6 individuals shared is their history. Their experience becomes our history that we cannot, should not, dare not deny. So as we think about today's program and think about what we take from it, I've taken a number of notes, and Mr. Keat, I think what he said was, I'm to put this into context for all of Hanover's history. Now look, I mean, you know, I like a challenge. I'm not up to that challenge. So what I can do though, is to put today's commentary into context for me, from where I sit, from my experiences, and how I hope to think about this going forward. So from Mr. Lewis, there are a few keywords that I took down from each of the panelists. So for example, from Mr. Lewis, what I'm taking away is, what if we turned a no into a maybe? The experience that you described with the administration was an all-out no. But your question was, what if it had been a maybe? Then perhaps the things that transpired would not have. Becky Bray, I would just want to know, were you one of those hippies at VC? Mr. King, I think I got this quote right. Time allows us to reflect on our wounds and figure out how those wounds occurred, which tied then into Ms. Higgins' comment about carrying some level of PTSD along with us. So for those folks who experience whatever part of life might be challenging or difficult, the fact is, you know, I will personalize, I often have equated this notion of post-traumatic stress disorder with those who may have served our country in the military or who may serve in public service type areas like police or fire or, okay? But the fact is that trauma affects all of us. And it affects all of us in different ways. And so that term, as I've come to understand it more, PTSD is not relegated or limited to any one person. How we carry and experience our experiences is ours alone. And so, for those of us who have experienced trauma, time allows us to reflect on our wounds, and then allows us to figure out how those wounds occurred. And perhaps the next step then is to figure out what we do with that. Does that hurt, does that wounding serve as a launch pad for improving where we are and where we want to be as a community, as a culture, as a people, as a society? Or does it force us, compel us, require us to be quiet? Everybody has to answer that question for him or herself. And it's a process. And so we give ourselves time and space to experience that process. Ms. G talked about sacrificing the familiarity of John Gandy in order to make a step forward. That is courage. And someone else mentioned the notion, Ms. Higgins mentioned the need for courage. And so there's a connection in what the two of you shared for me. And then, Mr. Trivett, you talked about becoming less clueless and understanding that sometimes there are boundaries or borders that we set for ourselves or that are set for us. And then perhaps the question is, what do we do with the borders? Do we push against them? Do we stay squarely between them? Do we challenge those borders? And that's what tonight's program, and programs that actually I think this is the 10th year that this program has been held. This program allows us as a community to think differently about the borders that may have been artificially or purposefully set for us, and asking ourselves the questions, are we going to continue to accept those borders? Are we going to push against them, all up against the side of them, right? Until they come down. Because unless and until we decide that the borders are artificial, unnecessary, detrimental, they will remain in place. One of the good fortunes I've had in my professional life had been to serve on the Virginia Board of Education from 2017 to 2022. And for those of you who may not be paying attention to what's happening, I'm no longer on the board, unfortunately, but if you're not paying attention to what's happening with the Board of Education and the history standards of learning that are right now being reviewed. Programs like this are important. The curriculum is important. Hear me when I say the curriculum is important. It's important for us to say these are the things, A, B, C, D through Z, that we want our young people and all of us to understand and know. The curriculum is only one part of history because no textbook, no set of standards can fully explain what we heard here tonight. Someone said that the experiences are history books. That's one thing. But a history book can't fully flesh out and round out experience. Textbooks are words on the page. The people that we interact with bring history to life. I encourage you to please pay attention to what's happening with the Board of Education, the Department of Education, with public schools. Please pay attention and be engaged. There is an importance to history. Hank Smith said, when we learn about the past, we gather strength for the future. Let's learn about our past, continuing to learn about our past, so that we can be strong for the future that's ahead of us. And I'm going to take a point of privilege, and I hope that this is okay.
It's okay.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis and Mr. King's experience that they recounted really puts this in my spirit. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Some of us recognize that there is power in, not a threat of. There is power in music. There is power in lyrics, in poetry. We need not be threatened, but we can learn from why the past required James Weldon Johnson and his brother to write and compose that piece of poetry and music. When we learn about the past, we gather strength for the future. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Jamelle. We can tell that you've spent your work life in education, because whenever you speak, we learn more. So thank you for that. Now I'm pleased to share with you something that I promised you earlier that you were going to get. I'm pleased to welcome the Community Gospel Chorus, directed by Tyler Spurlock. Tyler is supposed to get you to clap your hands and stomp your feet. So if you don't do that, don't blame me. That's on him, okay? But he's going to do it. Thank you. So they're going to move these tables to the chorus. Choir can come on up. the hand clapping, and I heard some foot stomping. So we're not going to take the check back from them. Let us give all of our participants a big hand for what we have. This is not part of the program, but early this year, through the Downtown Association, Ashland Association, we had an opportunity to talk to some other communities that were looking at how Ashland did business. And we had an opportunity to talk to them about the Untold Stories program and what we did and how we put it together. And they were extremely impressed. And several of them left saying they were going to try to do the same exact thing. We are trendsetters. We are showing people how to bring our community together. In line of the stuff we've been hearing, when we share history, we're not tearing people down, we're not destroying people, we're trying to bring people together. So we need to continue to share our history, and we don't have to share the bad history. We can share the good history as well, but share the history, regardless of what you do, share the history. And please, please, talk to your family members before they leave us and find out what's going on. And when I used to work over the Hanover College, I used to ask the students to go back and talk to their families, talk to their grandparents. And they learned things that they never knew. And I had one parent send me a note saying, "Thank you for making my grandson talk to me." So make sure you talk to your family members. Amen. Well, I'm going to ask that you, as we move forward, I ask that you plan to join us again next February. Reserve your seat, write your name on it. We're going to be back here next February where we can present another edition of Untold Stories. I ask that you will be safe, drive safely, and remember to record your stories so that you can share them with us and the community. Thank you for being here.